So I thought this title was clever. Maybe y'all don't, but you know, we're killing not just 2 birds with 1 stone, but we're going to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, because we're going to talk about the CRCC Code of Ethics, as well as the IDEA process. And for those of you that are just educators, we'll talk about educational professionalism and how they all kind of go together. I just like the first one this morning, I have to put this disclaimer up to say that KSB school law only represents entities. This is not me giving you advice as your personal lawyer, blah, 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 you know, this stuff. So lawyers ruin all the fun. So here's what I have planned for us for the next hour and a half. First, we're going to talk about the nature of the counseling relationship. We'll talk about both rehabilitation counseling plans and plans that deal with the student's employment needs and independent living goals. We'll also talk about the relationship that you have with clients, especially as it regards to social media and technology. And then, so that's the first probably 3/4 of what we're going to talk about. And then at the end, we're going to talk about confidentiality, privilege, and keeping privacy for students and clients. So that's our game plan. I got to become more familiar with this code of professional ethics for rehabilitation counselors. And again, my goal here was to try to find something that would places where the ethics rules in the CRCC interacted with the IDEA, and there's some kind of cool overlap. So I did go through the advisory opinions from the CRCC Code of Ethics, and this question from advisory opinion number 41 seemed really relevant to what we're talking about today. So the question is a certificate bound when you're working with a school and you're working with a student with disabilities on behalf of a school, if you hold the CRC license, are you bound by the Code of Ethics at the same time? Do you have to follow both sets of rules? And then the second question is, are these activities considered rehabilitation counseling when you are working with a school where someone else that didn't have a counselor certificate could actually do this job? And then the third question in advisory opinion number 41 is, how much of the stuff that we find out as a rehabilitation counselor that we find out as part of a school gig, what of that is confidential? So basically this question was, where does the overlap happen between CRCC and school, and where can I avoid having any kind of ethical obligations or ethical violations? So the answer to number 1 and 2 are yes. The committee says that there's a number of aspects of your activities when you're working with a school district on transition for a student that also fall within the scope of rehabilitation counseling activities. That's why schools want you as a rehabilitation counselor, because you are performing duties that rehabilitation counselors are uniquely qualified to perform. That means even though you're working for a school district, you're still bound by the code, and you still need to use the CRC designation in the performance of your activities. The answer to number 3 was much more lawyerly. It was sort of, it depends. You are obligated to comply with all relevant state, federal, and agency rules regarding confidentiality, and you have to keep confidentiality consistent with the Code of Ethics, and we'll talk about that specifically. But this advisory opinion number 41 does recognize the fact that you're wearing 2 hats when you're in an IEP meeting. If you're a rehabilitation counselor, you're both have to comply with the rehabilitation ethics and comply with the public school district's laws. I think this cartoon is hilarious. You see that Pooh has a honey bear and Pooh faces a crisis of ethics. Come on, that's funny. Thank you. I see some of you laughing. We're just talking about the steps in ethical decision making. And when you're working with someone with cognitive impairments in particular, it's helpful to have a specific process. So you have to recognize the problem, then you collaborate with the client to define the problem and help the client to understand what the issue might be. You brainstorm and develop solutions in consultation with the client. You select a solution. Then you review the process with the client, and if necessary, re-examine your selection or re-choose a different option. Then you implement and evaluate with the client, and then you continue to reflect. Now, this morning when I talked about how transition processes, when you're doing a transition plan, it's a process that you come back to year after year. It's kind of interesting to me how that interacts with this process that's described here, right? So a student who's going to be a sophomore initially says, I want to be a veterinarian, and it becomes obvious that the student doesn't have the science skills to be a veterinarian, you use this process to come back to the transition plan and say, okay, well, maybe not veterinary science, maybe a vet tech, maybe, you know, you start brainstorming for possible solutions to that problem, which is entirely consistent with the decision-making model that's set forth in the ethical code. You are supposed to be conversant with all these obligations. And so I just started buzzing through the standards, and we can see where they interact with the IDEA. So standard A.3.A says rehabilitation counselors are supposed to review with clients, both orally and in writing, the rights and responsibilities of both the rehabilitation counselor and of the client. And then these are presented in a manner best suited to the needs of the client. That means you have to, at the beginning, now remember, we're now talking about the fact that you are a rehabilitation counselor at the same time you're working with a school. So you're wearing those two hats. At the outset of that professional relationship, you have to include a disclosure of your qualifications and credentials, the purpose, goals, techniques, limitations, and the nature and potential risks and benefits of the services. That's something that's different under the ethical code than what your obligations are under the IDEA. And yet you are still obligated to make that disclosure to the client. The frequency and length of services, which hopefully will be consistent with the IEP, but that obligation is separate and apart from regular disclosures. And then the confidentiality and the limits regarding your confidentiality, the people to whom you have to disclose information about the client. This one, I don't know that any of us ever would have thought that schools were going to be closed because of a global pandemic when we started the 1920 school year, but that's certainly a possibility as we start the 2021 school year. So I think talking with clients about the contingencies about what you're going to do if school gets closed, if God forbid one of you gets COVID and becomes very, very ill, thinking about what your options are, what the contingencies are to continue services to the client in light of the fact that we're in a global pandemic is something that we need to add into our standard stuff. Most of the time you won't have to worry about fees or payment arrangements because you're contracted with the school. You do need to spend some time thinking about record preservation and to whom you can release records. If you're contracted by a school district to be providing these services, you're governed by FERPA, which means you can only release information consistently with the exceptions to FERPA without parental consent. You're supposed to disclose the risks associated with electronic communication. So if you're going to communicate with a client via email or text message, I would not recommend communicating with clients using Snapchat or Instagram, although I'm sure there are lots of students who would prefer that. But you need to tell them that, you know, there is a possibility that electronic communication can be compromised. It's not as secure as traditional analog communication. And then you're also supposed to disclose any legal issues affecting the services. So as I said at the very beginning, I think a lot of these obligations overlap, and training in one area really serves you well for training in those other areas. I love this cartoon. Only educators will find this funny. If you're as sick of Maslow's hierarchy as I am, sometimes maybe you'll think this is not that funny. I thought it was hilarious. Okay, so standard A, it just talks about the general counseling relationship, tells you that you're supposed to work cooperatively with clients and establish trust, respect autonomy and independence, which can be hard when you're dealing with a significantly compromised population. And you have to make reasonable efforts to ensure that clients' decisions are made in an informed manner where they have all the information that they need, and particularly understanding the cultural background of the client, as well as your own cultural background to see if you have any implicit biases that would interfere with your ability to make recommendations impartially. So I'm going to take those same obligations, and then underneath each one, I'm going to talk about how the IDEA reinforces that. So first, standard A says you're supposed to work in cooperation with clients. Good news, the IDEA regulations require that transition planning be done in consultation with the student and with the parents. So you've got that one covered in spades. Second standard, that you establish trust and respect and safeguard the privacy and confidentiality of information that you discover. That is also consistent with the IDEA because you have confidentiality obligations in FERPA and in the special ed laws, and that underlies your productive professional relationships. Third, you're supposed to respect client autonomy and independence. That's awesome because a lot of the IEPs that we develop for students as part of a transition plan specifically articulates the need for students to engage in self-advocacy and develop some independence, especially in the life skills area. So again, that reinforces your ethical obligations. Making reasonable efforts to ensure that client decisions are informed. You're supposed to give prior written notice to families before you implement any services under the IDEA. And so when you're providing that input, they get the right to understand what their ability is to challenge these decisions in due process or with the Office for Civil Rights. And so you're making these informed decisions. The cultural backgrounds, there's not exactly a perfect fit in the IDEA to fight implicit bias, although there is a general obligation to have non-discrimination in educational programs. So again, I thought it was kind of cool that the ethical obligations in Standard A really line up with a lot of the same obligations that you have under the IDEA. Standard A.1 sub A says that the primary responsibility of counselors is to respect the dignity of clients and to promote their welfare. They define clients as individuals with, or I gotta move my thing, individuals with who are directly affected by a disability who receive services from rehabilitation counselors. At times, your counseling may be provided to individuals other than those with disabilities, like if you're doing an evaluation for a school to help have a school identify a student's needs, but you're not actually going to counsel that student. That's a forensic evaluation, and then you don't have a client, you just are just working with the school. Oh, look, I had specific things. So the clients defined as individuals with or directly affected by a disability, that goes along with the definition of disability enumerated in the IDEA. So the IDEA says a child with an enumerated disability qualifies for an IEP if, because of that disability, the student needs special education and related services. And then here are the 13 categories of impairment, just so that the deck is complete. I think most of you know about all that stuff. The other sentence I want to pull out of this Standard A1 sub A is that when you're employed to render an opinion for a forensic purpose, you don't have a client. And again, we don't do this a lot in public education, but I have. In fact, I just settled a case just last week where mom was arguing that the transition plan was inadequate for her kid. And we hired a rehabilitation counselor to do an evaluation of the student's life skills needs so that we could use that to inform the school district's decision about whether or not we were going to fight this due process case. In that situation, the counselor didn't have a client because they weren't going to actually give advice to the disabled person. It was a forensic evaluation that they did for us. So in that case, you don't call them a client, you call them the evaluee, which you guys probably already knew. Kind of following up on those obligations, advisory opinion number 126 from 2012, a rehabilitation counselor submitted 3 separate questions. To whom do we disclose notice of evaluee rights? Do we do it to the disabled person, to the family, to the school? Who gets all these disclosures that we've talked about? And again, who is the client? Is it the kid or is it the parent? Which is a problem we struggle with in the IDEA as well. To whom does our obligation run? And under the IDEA, the obligation runs to the kid, not to the parents, even though the parents are the ones that are affecting the student's rights. And then the third question that the committee considered in this advisory opinion is what's the appropriate involvement in consult? How much should we consult with the child or the parent in light of the fact that they have separate rights to be involved in individualized planning in the IEP process? So the committee said here, the student is the recipient of the services. However, since the student in this case, it was a minor or might be cognitively impaired and unable to act on his own, disclosure then can be provided to the parent and to the guardian. Now, the committee said, and I think this is really a thoughtful kind of straddle, the written disclosure should be provided to the parent, but you should also try to verbally disclose to the child or the student if you can disclose in a way that's consistent with their level of understanding and cognitive functioning. Consultations and meetings with the child and the parent may be beyond the scope of the agreement you have with the school. You've been hired by the school district or consulted by the school district to advise the IEP team And be careful about being drawn into like a side relationship with mom or dad or the student that would be inconsistent with your role on the IEP. And then the committee specifically said that it's incumbent upon the counselor to figure out how you're going to treat requests for these kind of on the side services. This is something that I see happen a lot with rehabilitation counselors, speech pathologists, school psychs, like outside contracted service people. Sometimes when the relationship between the parent and the school is difficult or acrimonious, the parent reaches out to professionals that they perceive don't work for the school, so they might not have taken, you know, a side. And be leery of getting drawn into those kind of relationships, because it really undermines your effectiveness as an impartial team member when you're doing the rehabilitation counseling. I've seen it several times where the outside, the transition voc rehab person or the rehabilitation counselor, mom or dad kind of says, this is my sort of my expert, my hired gun, and now if they want to fight, they think that you're at their disposal, and that's just not how that relationship works. So that's standard A.1.A. Now A.1.B talks about the rehabilitation counseling plan. And again, that reinforces the transition plan that we're putting together as part of the IEP. So this standard says that rehabilitation counselors and clients work together to develop an integrated, individual, mutually agreed upon written rehabilitation counseling plan that offers a reasonable promise of success, and that's consistent with the abilities and circumstances of the clients. That is exactly what we do in the IDEA when we are putting together a transition plan. And so those two things really should work to reinforce one another. You are supposed to regularly review rehabilitation counseling plans. Under the IDEA, we only have to review plans once a year, unless there's some other need that crops up. Here, you don't have any specific time frame. It's just supposed to be a regular review to see if it's still viable and effective. This is a rehabilitation counselor that asked whether or not it was okay to do a rehabilitation plan in a forensic capacity. So basically the counselor is saying, I've never met this kid, I've never interviewed this kid, I haven't interviewed the parents, but the school has sent me the file and I'm gonna look through the paper. In that case, can I develop a rehabilitation plan? And the committee said, really, that's not a rehabilitation plan. By definition, a rehabilitation plan is developed in consultation with the client. Here, what you're doing is a forensic report, and in that case, you don't have a client, so you wouldn't develop a rehabilitation plan. You can make some suggestions. You could have a suggested course of action, but don't label it rehabilitation plan, because that's not really what you're doing here, because you're not consulting with the client. Quick entertaining note, I think it's advisory opinion 43, right around in the 40s. There's a hilarious advisory opinion where the person with a disability wanted to be an exotic dancer. And so they asked the committee about whether or not it would be ethical for the rehabilitation counselor to assist the client in becoming an exotic dancer. And the answer was yes, that would be ethical, as long as the client has the skills and abilities and talents to be successful in that endeavor. It would not be unethical to assist the client in becoming an exotic dancer. Come on, you got to look for your fun where you can find it. I was entertained by that. So that's the rehabilitation plan as defined for rehabilitation counselors. And here is what the IDEA requires for the development of a plan. You develop that plan at the IEP meeting with all required participants, just like the rehabilitation plan is developed in consultation with the client. So again, these two things can do hopefully double duty for you because you're meeting all of your obligations to confer with all the required participants. We won't go through all of this because we did it this morning, but I have the child with the disability with the asterisk here because that meets your obligation to confer with the client when you're putting together a rehabilitation plan. Now, parents have a unique role in this process if you're working with a public school district, because the IDEA guarantees parents the rights to participate in the IEP process separate and apart from the student's right to receive those services. So in a rehabilitation plan, there's no specific obligation to confer with parents, although that client can include the client's parents. The IEP team is specifically obligated to consider suggestions and incorporate some of the input from parents. You have to discuss placement options and answer parent questions. If you fail to follow the IEP, even after the parent has requested, so for example, a parent can't say, you know what, we said that Johnny was going to go work at the grocery store for his after school job as part of his transition plan. I hate that guy at the grocery store. I want to stop Johnny from going to the store. You are still obligated under the IDEA to continue implementing that plan until the team has had a chance to gather and formally change the student's placement. And that's a little bit different than the obligations you have ethically for your rehabilitation plan. For IDEA purposes, FAPE requires you to follow the IEP. If you don't follow the IEP, you're by definition not providing a free and appropriate public education. And here's a couple of examples of outside contractors who just unilaterally decided to change the plan and got their hands slapped for it. This Minnesota case is a speech clinician who just decided on her own that the student needed more speech. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to say that a family is going to sue you for giving a kid more than what he's entitled to, but the speech path was pulling this kid out of the gen ed classroom to give the kid additional services. And that was found to be a violation of the student's right to a free and appropriate public education, because you can't pull him out of the classroom to give him more services because he's missing out of general classroom instruction. This is another quote about not being able to unilaterally change the IEP. An IEP, like a contract, may not be changed unilaterally. Any such unilateral change is a per se violation of the IDEA because it vitiates the parent's right to participate at every step of the IDEA process. Again, this is a place where the IDEA diverges from the CRCC ethics, because you would be able to, so long as you had met with the client and talked it through, change the client's work placement way faster if you don't have this IDEA obligation on top of it. But remember that the IDEA considers that work placement to be an educational placement, so you can't change it unless the team supports that change. That's the point of that. Real quick, I'll tell you a quick story. I'm trying to be efficient, but then it gets boring if I don't tell a few stories. We had a student with Down syndrome that had been placed in his job placement at like a conference center where they, held events. And so he wiped down the tables and cleaned the toilets and mopped and did that kind of thing. Well, the chemical, whatever the chemical was that they used to clean the toilets, made the student nauseous. And so the job coach that the school had going to this conference center with the kid, the job coach just started cleaning the toilets. And so then while the job coach cleaned the toilet, this kid wandered off and got into trouble and had some kind of sexual ideation going on with some of the conference attendees. And the school is the one that ended up getting sued by the people that were sexually assaulted, because the student, not like raped, but groped. I mean, not that that's okay, but but the school's defense was that he was supposed to be cleaning toilets, and we lost that case because the supervisor that was supposed to make sure the kid was cleaning toilets was actually doing the toilet cleaning herself. So those are the kind of things, if for some reason the job placement isn't working, there's some condition that's not making this practical, you just can't take it on yourself to change it and fix it. You need to work all of that through the IEP team if you're working with a student who's still in a public school setting. That's the point of that. Requirements for developing transition plans under the IDEA are a little bit more involved than under the CRCC. The plan has to be based upon appropriate evaluations and assessment. We do look for both formal and informal assessment tools. This is a quote from Nebraska's transition planning guidance document. I told you this morning that I actually prefer the stuff that South Dakota has out on this. But I think this is a good observation, that informal assessments, since they're more subjective, they're better when you have multiple informal assessments from multiple assessors, so that one person's biases aren't driving decisions that get made. They have to be appropriate to the age and skill level of the student, and that individualization aspect should permeate all of the levels of planning and implementation, just like we talked about this morning. And again, you don't have to have parental consent for transition evaluations. A couple other CRCC advisory opinions that I thought would be relevant to our discussion. This is one where the rehabilitation counselor wrote in and said, my client has a felony conviction on his record. Do I have to disclose that or advise the client to disclose that when we're trying to get him a job placement? And the advisory, the committee said that if you omitted pertinent data, that would be a violation of Standard A, and it also could be a significant disservice to the client. So if you know that, and that the student that you're working with has the propensity to violence, that's one of the things that we're struggling with as we're placing kids on the spectrum. If we know that this kid has a hair trigger, we know he has a propensity to fly off the handle, you can't just omit data if you think it would be harmful to the kid's employment chances if that data is relevant and pertinent. That's what this advisory opinion says. Number 98 was the rehabilitation counselor had asked the family to share medical records, and they hadn't gotten those medical records yet. And so they had asked the committee, is it okay for me to do a rehabilitation evaluation without all the relevant data? And the committee said no. You're obligated to withhold judgment on a particular matter until you have enough evaluative data to provide adequate advice. This is something we run into all the time, where mom and dad say that the kid has this or that medical condition, but we don't have the documentation to support it. And what this opinion says is, if you know that there's a significant chunk of relevant data that you're missing, you can't just go without it. You have to wait for that before you give the actual rehabilitation plan. And this reinforces that if you need to request to review other expert opinions, in this one, I think it was a mental health evaluation, it is appropriate to wait to prepare a vocational plan until you have all that information. Again, these are issues that these advisory opinions kind of jumped out at me because these are all issues that we struggle with in a public school setting when we're trying to place a student into like a school to work kind of situation. So under the IDEA, your transition plan has to have three main components. It has to talk about the instruction that we're going to give the student to support him or her in reaching their post-secondary goals. It's supposed to include community experiences that allows the student to develop roots into the community, and you're supposed to develop employment or other post-school living objections. When it's appropriate, you have to include the acquisition of daily living skills and functional and vocational evaluations. And all of these things are supposed to happen for all kids within IEP. If you have a super cognitively high performing student who doesn't need daily living skills, you should at least include in the present levels of performance the fact that you talked about that whether or not the student had any needs in that area, and use the data that you relied on to draw the conclusion that they didn't need that support. As I already talked about this morning, so I don't want to belabor it, but do avoid ambiguous language like as appropriate or as needed. And you can go look at my notes from this morning about why I hate that. So this morning when we talked about the obligation to do transition, I used South Dakota Administrative Code. Now, in this one, I just have the federal law so that you can see the two go hand in hand. Somebody raised their hand and I don't know how to call on you. So if you have a question, stick it in the chat. But I don't know how to put your hand down, so I'm sorry. It has to include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals based upon age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, and employment, and where appropriate independent living skills, as well as the services. So again, you have goals and services, and they both support the student's transition plan. Now the focus of the IDEA is supposed to be on the needs of the individual student, not broad classes of disability. I know it's easy to talk about, we have had students on the autism spectrum that have been successful at X, but be careful that you're not slotting students into employment opportunities based on disability as opposed to their individual skills and desires. The services and the assessments or evaluations are supposed to be individualized. One thing that I hear from rehabilitation folks that I work with is, oh no, we always give students the X, the ASVAB or career cruising or whatever the evaluation is. Make sure that you don't fall into the trap of saying that the instrument fits the kid unless you truly have selected that evaluation based on this student's individual needs. Only providing just the same thing that all juniors get or that all sophomores get, that's not sufficient unless the team has considered the student as an individual and said that will be sufficient for this student, right? So it doesn't mean that going to a career class that everybody takes can never be adequate, but you can't just rely on that as a one-size-fits-all solution. And then the goals have to be individualized. Don't use the same goals across student groups. We talked about that this morning. So this is a classic example. I've seen this happen a bunch when schools started getting really falling in love with assessments and like the high stakes testing that everybody loves to talk about how schools are doing compared to other schools. This is a student with a specific learning disability. He's entering 9th grade, so he's going into high school, but he's only reading at the 1st grade level. And everybody agrees that that is an accurate assessment of his reading ability. The IEP team, though, did not do any specific transition assessment. They checked the box on the IEP that said the assessments were done, but nobody bothered to follow up to see if they had actually been conducted. The IEP also included a form goal that said, by the end of 9th grade, Johnny will be reading at 9th grade level. Everybody that was on the IEP team knew that there was no chance that this kid would be reading at a 9th grade level by the time he finished 9th grade. But they thought mistakenly that when you moved a child into high school, you had to regurgitate the state standards in order to be compliant with the state requirements. That's just not true. This case went all the way up to the 11th Circuit. And the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said that the post-secondary goals and transition services were obviously not created in compliance with the IDEA because you didn't do any assessments. No matter how good your goals are, no matter how good your services are, unless you've done an assessment to see what the kids' needs are, what you do afterwards is not going to be adequate. The 11th Circuit said nothing in their transition services aligned with the student's abilities or academic goals. They had listed a 4-year college as this kid's goal. Obviously, if you're reading at a 1st grade level when you're entering high school, a 4-year college is going to be a stretch. And so the court said this denied the student of a FAPE. We further agree with the district court, says the 11th Circuit, that this lack of individualized planning and programming for the student's education deprived him of a FAPE. For example, the vague language used to describe MS's post-secondary goal, student will be prepared to participate in post-secondary education, didn't match the fact that he was on a track not to receive a diploma, but to receive a certificate. So, and I think most state departments of education have gotten this figured out, but there occasionally will be someone from the State Department of Ed that says all students in 9th grade must have as at least a goal that they're reading at a 9th grade level by the end of 9th grade. That's just not true, and it's not appropriate for a student like this that obviously has some pretty significant cognitive impairments. So make sure it's not a form goal that everybody has. This cartoon, I had to laugh because it's just a joke on Karens. I've said for years that Karen was my generation's like Beulah, and that in 30 years, the only people named Karen are going to be in old folks' homes. And now that Karen has become a meme, I feel like I'm vindicated in saying that, you know, Karen is it's a specific, you don't know a lot of Karens that are not 53 years old, you know? You don't meet a lot of 12-year-old Karens in this day and age. Okay, so employment needs. We're moving through the CRCC standards. Standard A.1.C says that rehabilitation counselors work with clients to consider employment consistent with the overall abilities, functional capabilities, and limitations, general temperament, interest and aptitude patterns, social skills, education, general qualifications, transferable skills, geographic locations, and other relevant characteristics and needs of clients. The IDEA is not this specific to rattle off all of these things that you consider, but if you consider all of these items when you're doing an IDEA transition plan, you're 100% going to have hit your marks under the IDEA. So again, these two things reinforce one another in terms of rehabilitation counseling for employment. You're supposed to facilitate placement of clients in positions consistent with their interests, culture, and welfare. That culture piece is something that doesn't appear in the IDEA, but I think is really relevant to what we're doing to have a student be successful. And you're supposed to help clients understand potential constraints on their employment and placement choices. So this one's kind of tricky because it is hard to say to a kid, I'm sorry, you don't have the chops to be a firefighter. You know, it's not really realistic for you to think that you're going to be a college professor. But it's right here in the ethical standards that you have to help the client understand what those limitations are so that they can actually find employment opportunities that are going to be meaningful for them. I love this one. I wanted to put this in this morning's deck, but I saved it for this afternoon because this one makes me laugh. So they asked the kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he says, well, I either want to be an auto mechanic, a business owner, or a professional basketball player. And so whoever's doing the transition interviews diligently writes down mechanic, business professional, basketball player. Now, query, how do you prepare a kid to be a professional basketball player? And if he's interested in being a mechanic or a business professional, those two things also seem kind of inconsistent with one another. There was nothing in specific in the plan about what they were going to do to help this kid achieve these goals. There's nothing about taking him to, you know, a bunch of games and watching LeBron James play or, you know, anything like that. And the plan just checked the box for post-secondary education, like assuming that he was going to go to a community college or a four-year school. Family files a complaint, and the independent hearing officer said, the plan is deficient. There's no concrete plan for the student to achieve these goals and receive services related to these goals. And again, I query what services you would give a kid other than stretching him on some kind of rack to make him taller. I don't know what else you can do to help the kid become a professional basketball player. This Central Bucks case is kind of interesting. This is a mom and a dad that are a nightmare. They have already, I think there's like 6 Central Bucks cases with this family. They just had repeatedly taken the school to due process. So this student is on the autism spectrum and has a speech language impairment. He's very interested in a career in agriculture, which I don't know about you guys. I have run against, encountered a lot of students who are in farm communities who have limitations like autism or an intellectual impairment, who really are interested in agribusiness, which, you know, thank God we have some resources in these rural communities to help kids have those experiences. So in this case, the district provided transition services on a one-to-one basis, and they had the kid doing like a classroom component where he was learning about like the life cycle of plants and the stamen and the pestle and all that stuff that we were supposed to learn that obviously I didn't. And then they also had a hands-on component where he would go to a greenhouse and plant plants and water them and kind of keep, you know, learn the growing process with a hands-on situation too. They wanted to provide experience at job sites, but mom and dad were really weird about, they did not want the kid to be transported any place in a car if there was any snow or ice. And then later, mom and dad objected to the kid even going to the greenhouse because it was like a 12-block walk, and they didn't want him walking outside in the cold to get this hands-on experience. Then mom and dad, you know, this family has already sued them a bunch of times. So the school was like, okay, that's fine. If you don't want him to go there, we don't have to go there. And then the school also said that mom and dad suggested some other places for him to work, and the school didn't think those places would be successful because they included like a bunch of loud noises and mechanical sounds. And this was a kid who, when he got overstimulated, he got physically aggressive. So the school was like, we don't think this other placement will work, but you won't let us drive him to the greenhouse. So, you know, we're basically stuck. So The bad thing that happened here was the school just let nothing happen for the kid in transition because mom and dad wouldn't let them. Now, you are never in a good defense posture in a special ed due process case when you are trying to say, we would have done the right thing for the kid, but mom and dad wouldn't let us, right? That is never a good defense posture. It's very frustrating as special ed professionals to say it, but parents all the time sue schools for doing exactly what the parent demanded that they do. So in this case, the family files suit saying that the school dropped the ball by not having him have better transition and these kind of agribusiness experiences, even though the parents were the ones that were objecting to the services being provided. Hearing officer rules for the school, or for the parents, says the school district failed to provide FAPE. The hearing officer said, you didn't have very good planning set out in the IEP. You just said he was going to go to the greenhouse, but you didn't include the practical things he was actually going to learn at the greenhouse. And when inclement weather set in, you didn't have a backup plan, even though you knew the parents wouldn't agree to transport. The fact that the school said that these other job experiences that mom and dad wanted him to have, the school was afraid it would trigger a meltdown. The hearing officer said, we don't have any evidence that he's ever had a meltdown in a workplace. He's exhibited meltdowns and issues at school, but there's no indication that he would automatically melt down at the workplace. Now, I'm here to tell you, I think the school lost on that first bullet point, not the second one. If the school had had a really well-designed transition plan and did not throw up its hands and say, mom and dad won't let us do what we're supposed to do, I think they would have won this case going away. And I think that this no evidence of meltdowns in the workplace was kind of a throwaway after the school did not do their job. Look what they awarded this kid. He got comp ed that could be used all the way up through his 24th birthday. So again, if the parents are saying, I don't agree to let the kid do that, you either need to reconvene the IEP team ASAP to create a plan that mom and dad will consent to, or you implement over mom and dad's objections. But you can't just sit pat and do nothing because mom and dad won't agree. That puts you in the worst possible defense posture you can face. So I just looked at my watch and is it 3:30 already? Wow. So when I said we take a break at 3:20, so I was a big fat liar, huh? So we go to 4:15. So we should take like a 5-minute break here, right? If your video camera is on, nod or shake your head no. Thank you all. I get excited and start rattling off and then kind of lost track of time. So let's just take a quick 5-minute break. You can stand, you can stretch, you can get another Diet Coke. And if you have questions that have come up, you can throw them into the chat and I'll answer them when we come back from this quick break. One minute warning, 1 minute. Okay, 3:35, we're in the home stretch of your everybody's favorite thing to get professional development on, which is professional ethics. Bev, do you have a secret word that you need to give now?
I do have a secret word, and it is so original. It's ethics.
Ethics.
Ethics is the code word for this session.
So everybody can quick jot down ethics so you are sure to get credit for this session. Again, just like this morning, I'm looking through how much material we have to cover. I never want to bore people, so I go fast and we'll get through it. So next thing we're going to talk about from the standards is the requirement that rehabilitation counselors assist clients in avocational and independent living goals. So you're supposed to develop these goals consistent with the client's abilities, interests. Again, culture is there, which is not in the IDEA, but I think it's a good addition. The client's interests, culture, needs, and welfare. This is a case from Tennessee from 2010. If any of you used to go to the tri-state and remember Melinda Jacobs, who was an amazing attorney and a friend of mine, she was the one that sang. This is one of Melinda's cases, and this case just made her mad every time she talked about it. So this kiddo has significant cognitive disabilities. Her IQ is 40. So you know this is a student that's going to have some substantial hurdles to overcoming on the way to being like gainfully employed. The district wanted to place the student in a program that was developed specifically to assist students with these really low IQs to develop independent living skills. Mom and dad opposed that vehemently. They did not want the student working on social and emotional skills. They wanted the student to learn how to read on grade level. And at the time this lawsuit was filed, this student, I think, was 21 years old, and she was reading at a second grade level. And the parents were just adamant that if an ABA therapist would only teach this girl reading, they thought that there was some way that the school was going to get this girl to be reading at basically at a senior age level. And the school district gave in to the parents in terms of having this tutor work with her. But they also insisted on having a transition plan that had independent life skills. And the ALJ said that that was clearly appropriate in light of the child's circumstances because she needed to learn these social skills. Now, contrast that case with this case with a student with on the spectrum who is exhibiting significant social skills deficits. The school district knew that this was a problem because he had significant behavior skills at school, but the transition plan never talked about the kid's behavior. The transition plan just talked about how this student was going to go to post-secondary and take these classes and whatever. They didn't do a formal transition assessment. And they never wrote any kind of behavior plan to address the fact that you can't have these violent meltdowns in the workplace and be a successful employee. And the court found that the failure to address these life skills presented a clear barrier to the student being successful in post-secondary transition. So in the first case, even though mom and dad objected to it, the school district implemented life skills and social skills in the IEP. Parents sued and the school won. In this case, the school ignored the behavior and social skills issues, just went straight for employment and academic issues. School district lost. So you should always include all of the needs of the client or the student when you're doing this kind of a planning. The court in this Massachusetts case said that the failure to assess to determine what the student's needs were and to develop goals related to his social and emotional needs constituted a failure to provide faith. This is one of the things that we struggle with kids on the spectrum, because students on the spectrum oftentimes have trouble generalizing behaviors. Students may learn that there is a particular way that you have to behave when you're in school. They don't automatically generalize that behavior to the workplace or to home or wherever. And here the court said that the school had an affirmative obligation to be sure that he had the skills that he needed to be successful outside of just the educational environment. Appropriate remedy was comp ed. If I remember right, it was 24 grand for 2 years that the school had to pay. Now the school said, you know what, judge, tell you what, we'll just make him eligible for IDEA services and we'll provide it ourselves. And the ALJ said, no, you can't do that. The school district was required to give the parents these funds to fund compensatory education that the parents selected. I don't know what this says about me, but nothing makes my children mock someone more than someone that misuses there, and there. So this cartoon is kind of funny to me because I'm a grammar Nazi, I think. So this is where I want to talk a little bit about the appropriate boundaries between the rehabilitation counselor, an educational professional, and a student. I used to, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. I used to not say this out loud because I don't want to offend you, but I have had in the last 5 years, I think I've had 2 or 3 inappropriate teacher-student relationships in each of the last 5 years. And so I'm just going to say it flat out, don't sleep with students, right? I know, I wish I didn't have to say it out loud. I see you doing a facepalm, Sonia, and I'm with you. but I have to say it because apparently no one is actually telling people this, right? So if you're lonely or sad, find another social outlet than your students. Because I really, really, really hate being involved in cases where students have been involved in inappropriate relationships with adults. But guys, it's happening all the time. Now, I will say, if you're my age, I have a very good friend who married her high school art teacher. I don't know what things were like, you know, in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid and I didn't know what all was going on. But I know that in 2020, it is not going to be okay, even if the student graduated a year ago, for a teacher to date a student. It's just not. So please, I'm begging you, don't do that. I know it seems stupid that I have to say it out loud, but you would not believe the stuff we see. So you're also prohibited by the ethical rules governing rehabilitation counselors from engaging in electronic or in-person sexual or romantic interactions with a client. So notice here that exchanging nudes counts, right? Even if you haven't actually had physical contact with the student, that's electronic sexual conduct. You're also prohibited from engaging in electronic or in-person sexual or romantic interactions with former clients, romantic partners, or their immediate family for up to 5 years. I did a case, jeepers, it's probably 7 years ago, where high school student graduated. The male teacher was also the girl's track coach. Girl ran track, girl had this teacher as a teacher. We find out probably about this time in the summer, around July 15th, that they have a sexual relationship, but she's graduated. She graduated in May. We went ahead and fired this teacher anyway. And at the termination hearing, the girl's mom testified that the girl's mom was perfectly fine with the girl having this relationship with a teacher. And then the teacher took the stand in his own defense, and the teacher's defense was, I didn't sleep with her till the 4th of July. So she was a former student. Understand that that relationship is still grounded in the teacher-student relationship. There is still an unequal power dynamic there, and that kind of situation is ripe for abuse. And the rehabilitation counselor ethics are awesome because they give you a specific timeline, 5 years, for you to be involved romantically with a former client, a former client's romantic partner, or their immediate family. So I don't want to belabor this point, but please, I'm begging you, don't sleep with students. You're also prohibited. Let's say that the romantic relationship existed and then you broke up, and now later on you would be asked to provide services. You're prohibited from providing services to previous sexual and romantic partners and friends and family if you can't be objective about those people. Prohibited from engaging in personal virtual relationships with current clients. That means through social media, and you have to document and follow these ethical procedures. Now, here's why I get so hepped up about this. The grooming process typically involves a predator identifying a vulnerable child. And by definition, the population that we work with are vulnerable students to being taken advantage of by an adult. Then the adult gains the child's trust through gifts or engaging in kind of peer-like conduct. Lots of times what happens is the adult sends a snap that is like boundary violating, not hugely boundary violating, but a little inappropriate, you know, a cleavage shot or a picture of somebody wearing a bikini or abs. And so that peer-like conduct, you know, makes the child think that they're special. And it also begins to desensitize the child to the fact that this is not appropriate. Then the adult says, oh, you can't tell anybody I sent you that picture, or I'd get in trouble. You don't want me to get fired, do you? Or you don't want me to tell anybody that you sent that picture to me. And so this isolation begins to reinforce with the kiddo that they have to keep the adult's secrets. And then that's usually when the sexual conduct begins. And the predator typically blames the child because if you didn't, you know, you made me do this, you wanted it, that kind of thing. The percentage of students abused by school staff members just makes me crazy. 7% or 3.5 million students, according to a study that was done by the US Department of Education in 2004. And I tell you, I don't know that 7% is what I've seen, but it's a lot. And that number does not surprise me, given what I see in my practice. According to the American Association of University Women, a study that they did separate from the Department of Ed study, they found 9.6%. Now there's some question on that one about their methodology, but one way or the other, 7 to 9% of students have been abused by some school staff member. 99% of that conduct was committed by school employees that were grooming the students. Here's the other thing I've learned in my practice. Not only do predators groom the students, predators groom adults. They make adults believe that the predator is such a wonderful person that you cannot even fathom that they would do anything inappropriate. Over and over again in these predator cases, I hear people say, I just can't believe it about Tim. He was the best. He was the best administrator we'd ever had. He would do anything for these kids. He came early. He stayed late. He would drive them home at night. And so just, I don't want to say that the better a person is, the more likely they are to be evil, but do understand that predators put up this false front for adults as well. And that's part of the grooming process. The problem is exacerbated, I believe, by widespread social media usage. Kids are on Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram constantly. And according to this study by Common Sense Media, almost half of parents do little. This is parents being surveyed. So the parents said that they do little or nothing to monitor their child's online behavior. That I think the actual percentage of parents who are involved is even lower, because these are the parents that admitted they don't do anything to monitor their kiddos. Almost 70% of students say that they know how to hide what they do online from their parents. And I don't think that the fact that a student has a cognitive or emotional impairment does anything to make them any less technically savvy. In fact, lots of times students with on the autism spectrum or with cognitive impairment have spent a lot of time mastering technology to the exclusion of other skills. So I don't think you can say that our clients aren't sophisticated enough to use these technologies to hide things from their parents. But here's an interesting statistic. If parents were more engaged, students say that they would change their behavior if they knew their parents were watching them or monitoring them. And about 40% of teens think their online activity is private. And again, this is data from Common Sense Media, who surveys students pretty frequently. Based on several meta-analyses, so these are data sets that have aggregated studies of sexual abuse of children, they found that students with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually abused than typically developing peers. Now, when you remember that the first step in the grooming process is to find a vulnerable child, obviously students with disabilities would qualify as more vulnerable than typically developing peers. So that statistic shouldn't surprise us, but it still, is a gut punch to me every time I see it. According to the meta-analysis done by researchers in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse, victims of sex abuse, adults were identified as the abusers in slightly more than half of the cases. Teachers in about 30% of the cases, and classified staff in the other 20% of the cases. 22.4% of the victims received sexual messages before the predator contacted them in person. And 16% received sexual images as the first time, as like the first opening door to being groomed by a sexual predator. So you can see that this digital component is a major contributor to students being taken advantage of. This case from Pennsylvania is just, it's classic, but it also just makes me crazy. We have a case very similar to this that's pending in Nebraska right now. So in this Pennsylvania case, there's an 8th grade student. She has ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. Her behavior intervention plan says that when she feels herself escalating and she's afraid she's going to lose control, she can seek out a trusted adult. And listed as one of the trusted adults in her plan was the dean of students at this school. So she would think that she was escalating. She'd go, instead of having a meltdown, she would go to the office of the dean of the school. But during the time she was in the office, he began grooming the student, and ultimately they had a sexual relationship, 8th grader, with the dean of students. The dean was ultimately found guilty of statutory sex assault, indecent assault of a child. You can see they threw the book at him, which I'm delighted about. This case is not the girl suing the school district because they exposed her to a predator. I think that's going to be the next lawsuit. This is due process saying that the IEP and the behavior intervention plan were inappropriate to provide her with a free and appropriate public education. What the parents are saying is, basically, school, your behavior intervention plan was to put her in the hands of her rapist. Maybe that improved her behavior, but that was not an appropriate plan. The parents argued that the fact that this girl took so many long breaks and missed so much instruction should have been a red flag to the teacher in the classroom that something was off. And that and the data showed that she did have fewer meltdowns after they initiated this behavior intervention plan. But the parents said that wasn't because it was a good plan. That's because she was in the office having sex with the dean, which was not okay. Hearing officer said, yes, indeed, the school district did deny this student a free and appropriate public education, and awarded 2.5 hours of comp ed for each day of the prior school year. And what this family is going to do, I'm quite certain, is now turn around and file suit against the school for violating Title IX. So the school had 2 violations here. One, the special ed violation, and 2, the fact that she was sexually assaulted by a staff member. You guys know this, but it's never a bad thing to remind you that you have a duty to report any time that you believe a student is in a situation that could result in substantial harm. If an apparent violation has substantially harmed or is likely to substantially harm persons or organizations, you are obligated to take further action as appropriate to the situation. That brings me to Title IX. I know that you guys probably don't spend a ton of time thinking about sex discrimination and sex harassment, but there are new Title IX regulations that the Department of Ed has just released that place real specific obligations on school districts when students allege that they have been the victim of sex harassment or sex assault. Whether the perpetrator is an adult or another student, Title IX regulations kick in anytime there's an allegation of disparate treatment based on sex. The reason I'm spending time on it now is because the new it used to be the old regulations said that there were only specific people that were obligated to take action if they had heard about a sex assault or alleged sex harassment. The new regulations say that every employee of the school district and every contractor of the school district is obligated to report allegations of sex harassment or sex assault to the Title IX coordinator. So even those of you that are not direct school district employees, if you're contracted with the school district, you can impose Title IX liability on the school if you hear about sex assault or sex harassment and you don't report that up the chain of command. And again, sometimes we get confused and we think that that has to be child abuse. It has to be an adult perping on a kid. But Title IX also applies to non-consensual sex between students. That's also a Title IX violation. Also, you have to report that as child abuse to law enforcement and up the chain of command as a Title IX issue. You're going to be hearing a lot about Title IX, I suspect, in the coming year because of these new regulations. So just keep your ears open to the fact that this is coming down the pike. Yeah, and report knowledge to a school employee triggers Title IX. This is a high school special ed student. She is groomed and targeted by her history teacher. The teacher sent the student explicit pictures on Snapchat. I can't tell you how many of these cases I've worked that it all starts with a picture on Snapchat. I had one 2 years ago, which was a music teacher, mother of 5 children, is having a sexual relationship with one of her high school male students. Her defense was, well, he started it because he sent me a dick pic and my only response was to take my top off and send him a topless picture. And I don't really care who started it, right? There's one adult in this relationship and it's you, so knock that crap off. So anyway, this high school teacher sent the student explicit pictures on Snapchat. The first time the school has any inkling that something is going on is the custodian is going down the hallway, cleaning the halls, and the teacher's room is closed and the door is locked. So the custodian takes out his keys and opens up the door, and because he's going to go in and clean the classroom, and he discovers that the teacher and the student are in the classroom with the lights off and the door locked. Custodian says, that doesn't seem quite right. And come to find out, the teacher had been kissing and fondling the student in this closed classroom. But what the teacher told the custodian is, oh, we were practicing an active shooter drill. I told her if there's an active shooter, this is what we do. We close the door and turn off the lights and we hide. And so I also was using a projector to do some specific learning with her. So it's nothing. The custodian did report this situation to the principal. The principal did talk to the teacher and say, dude, you can't be in a classroom with the lights off and the door locked with a student. But the principal took the teacher's word for it, even though this active shooter drill sounds like the craziest excuse in the world to me. Principal bought it and counseled the teacher not to be alone with students in his classroom. A few weeks later, the school is monitoring, the school has like a hashtag on Twitter for their school account. And so a different student posts on Twitter that this special ed girl was late to class because she was busy, quote, making out with the history teacher. Principal sees that tweet, principal begins to investigate and discovers, sure enough, this teacher is engaged in an inappropriate relationship with the student, suspended the teacher, contacted law enforcement, and then the teacher's arrested and convicted and all the right things happen to the teacher. The parents then sue the school under Title IX, saying that the school district should have known that something was up when the custodian found the teacher, and so they should have acted weeks before they actually did. School district here said, or the court here said no. The school did make a response when the custodian found the teacher and the girl in the classroom. The principal did talk to the teacher and say, don't be alone with students. There was no reason, says the court, for the school to believe that this was a sexual relationship at that point in time. And when the school did find out, they took prompt remedial action, so no liability. So again, this whole Title IX area, the most important lesson for you to take away is anytime something seems off for you, kick that up the chain of command. Don't just say, well, that something's weird, but I'm not going to do anything about it because it's really not my business. As professionals, everybody has a responsibility for making sure that kids are safe. And sadly, in this day and age, we just see a ton of teacher-student inappropriate relationships. Apparently, I like this so much, I've put it down twice. So I already told you that you can't provide services to previous sexual partners or romantic partners. You're prohibited from engaging in personal virtual relationships with current clients. The question is, can you text a current client about her job situation? Could you Snapchat a current client about her job situation? I think there is a way to do it, but I just don't know. I don't know that I would engage with any client on Snapchat. You don't know what they're going to send you, and it's really hard for you to prove what's been going on. I think you can text and other things that you would be able to save and have an artifact of that communication, as long as it's not a personal communication, as long as it's in your capacity as the counselor. Here's a question about like, what are the, what's a boundary? What's too close? What is an inappropriate service or favor to do for a client? So this is a client that doesn't have a car, doesn't have internet. So the client's basically prevented from searching for a job. And the client couldn't get Wi-Fi because he hadn't paid his bill for prior service. So the counselor asked the committee, is it okay for me to establish an account in my name if that is what needs to happen so that the client can get internet access and conduct his job search? And the committee said no. And it's nice to have, I love it that we have these clear boundaries put down by the committee. They said that that would be too much personal involvement in the client's life. It would be an improper extension of your professional boundaries. So you can't do things like co-sign for a loan, put the internet access in your name, put the cell phone in your name. All of those things would be boundary violations. And I think that's right. And I like the fact that they give good, clear guidance. Advisory opinion number 117 says you need to make sure that you're using social networking only for permissible professional purposes. I do want to put a quick asterisk down. If you have an entirely personal account that you don't have clients or students follow you on, and you don't identify yourself as an employee of Voc Rehab or of the school district, you do have a First Amendment right to tweet about politics or sex or whatever it is that, you know, get your juices flowing. But anytime you have a professional connection to that account, the ethical rules say that you only can use those accounts for professional purposes. So when I was a teacher, there was no social media because it was it was in the dark ages. But if I was in the classroom now, I would have 2 Twitter accounts. I would have Mrs. Hazi's Twitter account and Karen Hazi's Twitter account. And I'm a pretty active user of Twitter. I have a lot of kids that follow me. And so even though I'm not a school teacher, I'm pretty careful not to depict myself consuming alcohol on Twitter. I don't tweet about politics or religion because I just think that those are boundary violations. And that's exactly the rule that's been set down here in advisory opinion number 117. Even if you are using these things for professional purposes, you need to continually monitor, says the committee, to ensure that it remains appropriate and within professional boundaries. And of course, don't be spreading out confidential information on the internet. This one makes me laugh. Other requirements about social media technology and, you know, having appropriate boundaries. You are supposed to realize that you can counsel clients in ways that aren't in person. You can do, you know, Zoom and Skype and all that stuff. You are ethically obligated to attempt to understand evolving technology and resources so you can better serve clients. So for example, if you have a kid that's really jazzed about TikTok, you might need to download TikTok to understand how it works, even if you don't interact with the kid that way. And you're supposed to appreciate the implications for legal and ethical practice when you use these technologies. I'm still clicking through the standards here. I'm just checking my time. You're supposed to serve clients with the same level of competence regardless of the technological platform, which really became an issue during the school closures because a lot of counselors weren't very conversant with Skype and Zoom, and suddenly we all had to get that way. Standard J.2 sub A says you have to make reasonable efforts to ensure that the technology or equipment that's recommended for a client meets current standards of accessibility under the law. I don't know if any of you know who Haben Girma is. She's the first deaf-blind graduate of Harvard Law School. And if you ever have a chance to see her speak, she is a phenomenal speaker, very inspiring. I follow her on Twitter. She actually started a tweet storm last week because the National Federation of the Blind had their national conference. And although the materials were all accessible to somebody with a visual impairment, they were not all accessible to somebody with a hearing impairment. And so Haben's deaf and blind. And so she was tweeting about how disappointing it is to have a disability advocacy group not be accessible to all communication limitations. And what standard J.2.A says is that you are obligated to make sure that the resources you recommend to clients are accessible and meet those standards under the law. So I think technically if you had sent someone to the National Federation conference, you had committed a little tiny ethical violation because it wasn't all accessible, which is kind of interesting. J.2.B says you have to guide clients in obtaining reasonable access to pertinent applications. This is e-readers and that sort of thing to make sure that technology is available to clients. So this is exactly what I was talking about when you have both a personal and a professional page, which I think is wise. Standard J.4.A says you need to keep the two separate and clearly distinguish between the two kinds of electronic presence. It's largely permanent, shared beyond the privacy settings. Nothing on the internet ever goes away. I was hurrying to get to this slide because, you know, it's late in the afternoon. These are 2 screenshots of tweets posted by a teacher in Aurora, Colorado. The one on the right, the one that's kind of PG-13, is actually a video and she's twerking. The one on the left, she is talking about you can see that what she says here is, naked, wet, and stoned. It's pretty clear to me that these are violations of the standards of professional competency if you are putting stuff like that up on a public Twitter page. But again, given what I see, I just don't think you can be too obvious sometimes. So don't post wet, naked, and stoned. There you go. You've got your ethical rules for the day. You can jot all this down and learn. She was so fired, by the way, so super fired. If you do use social media, you need to be careful to respect clients' privacy. And this one is a rule that's way more explicit for rehabilitation counselors than it is for other education professionals. Looky here, you're supposed to avoid searching a client's virtual presence unless it is relevant to the rehabilitation counseling process. So you can't just internet stalk your clients just for fun. But if you are fearful that the client may have posted something that would be harmful to their employment opportunities, now that would be relevant and you can go ahead and search. As long as you disclose the fact that you're going to search in advance of conducting the search. My best advice is I think social media is a net benefit. I think you should use it to increase engagement and for positive purposes. I think you should keep separate personal and professional feeds. I don't think you should friend clients or students. There's a whole realm of ethical issues that happen there, but do model the behavior you expect from your students. It always cracks me up when I have teachers talk about how disrespectful kids are on Twitter, and then the teacher turns around and posts something mean about her principal, on her Facebook page. So model the behavior that you want with your students. If you have not already, this is a really good piece of homework. Think about what the protocols are for contacting students via text messages, or if a student Snapchats you, talk with your upline administrator about what they expect you to do in response to that student communicating with you in that way. Okay, we got 7 minutes to cover privacy and confidentiality. You're supposed to avoid posting any personally identifiable information unless the client has provided written consent to do so. A lot of like resource rooms or day schools have parents sign a media release so that we can post pictures of happy children on social media pages. Make darn sure that you know that the parents have actually signed that release before you post anything about kids. And in no circumstance should any kind of protected information be shared via social media platforms. So this is just the standard B. You have to recognize that trust is the cornerstone of the counseling relationship. Earn their trust, communicate, solicit information about the client only when it's beneficial to the counseling process, make reasonable efforts to ensure sharing is secure, hold ongoing discussions about when you're sharing information, and don't share confidential information without a sound legal or ethical justification. FERPA has an emergency exception, and the CRCC ethical rules has an exception when disclosure is required to protect the client from serious and foreseeable harm. So if somebody's threatening self-harm, says they have a gun in their backpack, that kind of thing, you can obviously immediately reveal that. And I thought this one would be particularly relevant in light of COVID-19 when school reopens. If a client discloses to you that they have a disease commonly known to be both communicable and life-threatening, like COVID, rehabilitation counselors may be justified in disclosing that information to identified third parties. Here's what we're starting to see, and I bet you guys are hearing these stories as well. Last weekend in Western Nebraska, a community held like a makeup prom, and a kid went to prom. She had been exposed to COVID. She had been tested for COVID, but she didn't have her test results yet. So she goes to this Western Nebraska prom, dances and mingles with all the other kids at the prom. On Monday, after the dance, she discovers that she's positive for COVID. But she didn't disclose that to anybody. Standard B2 would say that if that student had come to you and said, don't tell anybody, but I just had to have a COVID test because I was exposed, you would have an ethical obligation to disclose that information to identified third parties, like a principal or the health department. So it's just, I just think that's interesting and relevant to have a refresher on as we roll into the world's weirdest start of the school year. You can share information among team members. If you're on an interdisciplinary team, that means you can share stuff with IEP teams. You also have FERPA obligations as a contractor for the school district, or if you're a school district employee. You can only share confidential, personally identifiable information with parent consent, or if there's an exception. Even if you don't work for the school, if you have gotten information about this kid through the IEP process, for example, you are considered a school official, so you have to comply with FERPA, which also means the school maintains direct control over all of your records. So this is the classic student harming herself case. Somebody wrote into the CRCC ethics committee and asked for an advisory opinion about the girl was cutting and is self-injurious behavior. Does that warrant a breach of confidentiality for minor and for adult students? And the committee says you can disclose as long as it's consistent with other state and federal laws. It would be consistent with FERPA to disclose a student committing acts of self-harm under the health and safety exceptions. So I would have no problem. In fact, I think you would be ethically obligated to disclose to somebody if the student is engaging in self-harm. And here's the takeaway quote from that advisory opinion. The CRC always has the responsibility to ensure the safety of the client and others. This is essential information to disclose to members of the IEP team in a school setting, which might include the parents, so that they can determine an appropriate course of action. So 100% if a student confides in you that they're cutting or engage in other self-injurious behavior, you not only can, you must disclose that information to someone else. So in practice, understand that you have confidentiality obligations under both sets of rules, both the CRCC ethics and under FERPA. The school district does retain control over your education records that you get from the school district. And I think this is a conversation you should have among your other team members, what is okay to share and what isn't. Do please maintain your records carefully. I did I'm gonna stop here. I think that's this one just says that if you upload a student's image on Facebook, that's not automatically a violation of FERPA unless the parent has opted out of the directory information exception. So go and find your school district's directory information policy. It's gonna say what things the school can disclose without consent. And 99 times out of 100, it says the student's image is directory information, so you can still post pictures to Facebook. Okay, I wanna stop there and just answer questions because I saw that there were some questions that came up. Let's see, yeah, inappropriate relationships make me crazy. Thank you for understanding. Oh my gosh. Isn't it, as I'm looking at what people are saying here, it's just astounding to me how frequently we have these boundary violations. And some of it I do think has to do with the fact that culturally the distance between adult and child is being narrowed, and I'm not sure that that's good for everybody. Do the same legal ramifications apply to teacher-student relationships if the student reaches the age of majority but is still receiving public school education or services? So that's a two-part question. In South Dakota and in Nebraska, it is not illegal for a teacher to have sex with a student if the student has reached the age where he or she can legally consent. So an 18-year-old student having sex with a teacher, that teacher is not going to go to jail unless the child is so cognitively impaired they can't consent. They are going to get their butts fired, and they should lose their teaching certificate, and they should lose whatever their credential is to be a rehabilitation counselor. But we have not criminalized teacher-student sex relationships in either South Dakota or Nebraska. Now in Missouri, there's a law on the books that says if you're a teacher, you can't have sex with students, period, the end. So if the same question was asked to me in Missouri, the answer would be different. But it's not against the law. It's not a crime to have a sex with an 18-year-old student, even though it's sad. If we use Zoom to communicate with a student, do we need to record it, or would that go against student-teacher privilege? Is it different if you're teaching to a class of students? That's a really good question. And I fell deep. We researched the heck out of this when the schools first closed to see what our confidentiality requirements were for Zoom. If you are using a Zoom Pro account or a Zoom for Education account, Zoom ensures that those communications are kept secure. So you're not automatically throwing the doors open to anybody seeing the information that you have shared with the student. So if you're using the Zoom free account, it's more easy to hack, and they do data mine that for like ads and that kind of thing. So you want to have the school account, which is free for educational institutions, or the Zoom Pro account. You don't have to record all your interactions with a student. You certainly can, and it's a good protection for you to be able to establish that you did not do anything inappropriate. But if you record the Zoom session, that's going to be an education record that the parents can get a copy of upon request. So just be aware that if you record it, you have to maintain that recording and provide the parents with a copy if they ask for it. I'm not worried about the FERPA implications of group work. Like if you have a social and emotional skill group and there's like 4 or 5 kids that are participating, you don't have an obligation to keep the identity of the students secret from their peers. Like you could have them all in a classroom. And the student's family, the Department of Ed said that you don't have to worry about like mom or dad or brother or sister overhearing what's happening on that Zoom call, because by putting the student onto the Zoom, the family has consented to someone within earshot here overhearing some of the stuff you're talking about. So the confidentiality concerns with Zoom that we sort of started the closure with, a lot of those concerns were addressed, and I feel very confident that you can use Zoom ethically, even if the kid is Zooming in from their living room and other people can hear what's happening. So there you go. What time is it? Oh, 4:17. Gosh, I'm sorry. That's it. That's the end of your ethics. So hopefully it's, not only did you get your ethics hours, but you got some useful information out of this. It was great to be part of this virtual conference, although, like I said this morning, I'll look forward to when I can see everybody in person instead of just your little square faces. But thanks a lot, and thanks for having me, Bev.